Victor?
How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Beautiful summer day and the nation's birthday, right?
Absolutely.
Good to
July
see you.
3rd, here we go, right?
That's right.
My name is Victor Castro. We have Dr. Robert Kodosky with us, a professor at Westchester University in the history department. As I stated in our introduction, Dr. Kodosky has recently published a book about the Tuskegee Airmen in Philadelphia, in the mainline area. And today we're going to be talking about the significance, a little bit of the history about our Independence Day celebrations, give you a little bit of historical background. So Dr. Kodosky, how are you doing?
Doing great, Victor. How are you doing?
We're here dealing with all the things related to COVID and things of that nature, but doing well. Family's doing well, and your family's well.
Yeah, everybody is well here, so that's good. That's good to hear.
Yeah, yeah. We had a little bit of a conversation earlier yesterday talking about the 1918 flu epidemic, Spanish flu, and some of the correlations, some of the tie-ins with today's set of events. But before we get to that, let's talk about Independence Day. So July 3rd, July 4th, a couple of things going on, some fireworks for real.
Absolutely. Whenever I teach my students in teaching military history, and I always ask them as they're telling me whatever information. So what? What's the significance of whatever that history is? And certainly, I think in our own time, you mentioned the virus, right? I mean, an appreciation of liberty. Sometimes maybe we take that for granted, and independence, and the kinds of things that we're accustomed to that people had to fight for, and in some ways, we're struggling all over again, right, against a different kind of a thing. And then certainly too, I mean, with the other kinds of events going on throughout the course of the nation, you had mentioned the Tuskegee book, ones who during the Second World War who, had to fight for their right to fight for their country, became, in my opinion, amongst the greatest of the greatest generation, and then came back and continued to persevere and struggle for civil rights. And of course, that continues into our own time. And so, in many ways, the 4th of July constitutes a promise that as a nation, we're still working to fulfill. And, moving forward, I think, the best we can, and trying to have conversations and dialogues that, all stem back to the initial beginning of this country, right? The promise of this country.
Yes, yes. And what I found very fascinating in doing some of my research over the years with regards to specifically General Washington, if you look at his performance over time, it wasn't exactly a stellar performance.
Yeah, Victor, for my money, and I think George Washington was the greatest military leader this nation ever had. And let me say this, that is despite the fact, as you're suggesting, he never won a battle.
Yeah,
He,
yeah.
he won a skirmish in Trenton. He won a rearguard action on the way to Princeton, and a couple of things like that. But the reason I hold him so highly, and the reason I think that in some ways, we need to constantly go back to him. George Washington, as a young man, fought with the British during the 7 Years' War, and very much was an Anglophile, very much, someone interested in the military and wanted to fight the way the British did, which was with the greatest army in the world at the time, in linear fashion, sort of on the battlefield. Washington very quickly understood that he did not possess the resources to do that. He also understood that the nature of the war that he was engaged in was ideological and political. And it was about, in the parlance of our own time, hearts and minds. And perhaps, the soul of all of it was his army. And
Yeah.
he knew he needed to keep that army together. So as I talk to my students, and I grew up watching boxing, sort of like Muhammad Ali fighting George Foreman, right?
Yeah.
Floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee, and basically wearing out the British, because in the end, the British had to subdue a revolution, and that meant either breaking the will of the population or a permanent occupation. And the British had been at war with the French and other European nations for, by that point, over 100 years. And
Yeah.
so, from they weren't interested in a prolonged war. They weren't successful in winning away hearts and minds. And George Washington understood that at key times he needed to engage the British, but it was the idea, not the place, that mattered. So Boston, take it. New York, take it. Philadelphia, take it. But you're not going to take my army.
Yes.
And of course, he also understood that in a limited capacity, under people like Nathaniel Greene, the militia also had its place. The militia sometimes is overly romanticized in terms of its role during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
It played an important role, but I think one that is supplemental in the end to the Continental Army. And of course, too, and I'm sorry, Victor, George Washington also very much understood the importance of allies, right? And
Yes.
so, the help of the French and the help of other key people. And one thing I think, that is a lesson from that, sometimes since we've gone into situations where we're frustrated because our adversaries won't fight on our terms, and we're not able to grasp what the nature of the war really is. We haven't demonstrated the kind of flexibility, the kind of critical thinking, I guess, that George Washington was able to exhibit. I'm sorry. You got me all wound up, Victor.
I know. Well, and when I started doing, like I said, this has been a bit of a passion project for me also. One of the things that I found most notable is that as December was rolling around, 1775, we talk about Valley Forge and all the issues going on with Valley Forge. But the pressing thing was that everybody's commissions were going to be done in pretty short order, and if all his officers and non-commissioned officers were gone, because they were in tatters, right? They were barely hanging on. Not very well supplied, and if they had not been able to have a victory, from an emotional, psychological standpoint, it was going to be done, and that gave us the energy as a nation, or an early start of a nation, to go and press forward.
Yeah, Washington had an acute sense of timing. I mean, he demonstrated that, initially with, after he lost the city of New York, right? And today we talk about rules of engagement. Back then, there were rules to war, and one of the rules were that when the weather got bad, you didn't fight. You returned home to camp in the wintertime. Shortly after the Battle of the Brandywine in our own area, near where Immaculata currently sits, there was a Battle of the Clouds. In other words, and you're probably familiar, essentially, after the Battle of the Brandywine, Washington's force and the British were going to fight, but it rained, and that's not good for muskets. And so, like baseball, they had to call it a day, right? But after he lost New York, and it was winter season, right? It was Christmas, and he understood that there was an encampment in Trenton that he would be able to hit right across the Delaware. And so exactly what you're saying. Thomas Paine said it very well. You know, these are the times that try men's souls. And Washington talked about sunshine patriots. You know, you're in this for the long haul, and he understood time was on his side. As long as he maintained that army, the British at some point, like George Foreman fighting Muhammad Ali, were going to exhaust themselves.
Yeah.
And he was right about that. So that's very observant on your part. Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. My name is Victor Castro. This is Mainline Weekend. We have Dr. Robert Kodosky.
One other thing I think that's important about George Washington, and you're probably aware of this, when everything was coming to a conclusion, there was a group of his officers that were making demands upon the new government, right, for, pay for life and that sort of thing. I mean, they wanted to be taken care of, and there were fears that, once the British were gone, there might be some kind of then either civil war or coup by frustrated military officers. And George Washington appeared before them without his wig, and he had prepared a piece of writing, and he put on his reading glasses, and, he said, I understand your frustration. I understand the difficulties that this war has caused you. It cost me my eyesight, and it's made my hair gray. And he said it in this he diffused the whole thing because they had such respect for him, and he approached it, in a way that resonated.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the, so if we look at the history of the East Coast, which is primarily where most of these battles took place.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
They had New York Harbor was secured by the British. We had General Burgoyne down here running around doing his thing, right?
Right.
Chasing people through the countryside. The state of New Jersey, what's now known as the Meadowlands, was the scene of one of the great battles. And it forced people into choosing sides because, and some of that spirit still remains today. I mean, there's still a fighting spirit. They have a football team called the New England Patriots, right? And there's still remnants of that, a little bit of that genetic material, so to speak. New York had its moment, and of course, New Jersey was kind of a transitional area. But then Philadelphia, where everybody was meeting in what we now know as Independence Hall, where this was the central meeting point, where people came from the South, people came from the North, they assembled here, and they debated all these issues, as many of the issues that we face today. And in one case, kind of tying it to what we were talking about yesterday in terms of the Spanish flu of 1918, I finally remembered who it was. This little known guy called Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah. I think I've heard of him, Victor.
Yeah, he's just, has some, couple of footnotes in history. But he was the gentleman who proposed the start of Pennsylvania Hospital. Because we did have cholera epidemics, we did have yellow fever, malaria, and nobody really understood what all that meant. But he was insightful enough to, while all this other stuff was going on, to say, hey, not only do we need to deal with these political issues and these social issues, but we have medical issues that are affecting us. And if one portion of the population, which majority working people, are being affected by it, then it's going to affect us all. In other words, we all are going to go down with this. So in the midst of all this stuff, when we think about what's happening today, it seems like there's so many competing priorities. But this is one of the beautiful things about our country, is that we've been through worse. We've been through very challenging times. And when the great minds get together and apply science and logic and critical thinking, we come up with some very great solutions. And also adaptability from the people who need to be, who are being led, who look to leaders for those answers. Yeah,
and I think embedded in all of that is, this cooperative spirit, right? When the nation is, facing some type of distress, whether it's a conflict with an adversary or with a virus or whatever else, it's about sort of at the grassroots, communities coming together and, looking out for neighbors and taking care of one another and all the rest. And I think you see that within the spirit of someone like Benjamin Franklin, right? I mean, that understanding that, a nation ultimately is made up of communities of citizens. And, there is a book by a historian, his name is Benedict Anderson, who talked about nations as being imagined communities. And that's truly what they are, right? I mean, you have this geographic space, and I mean, what ties people to one another as Americans or, any other nationality? Well, it has to be some kind of, common set of values and ideas and interests and a willingness to sort of be there for one another, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise the whole thing just falls apart.
Yeah, and so in Philadelphia, if you go through Old City Philadelphia, what's now Penn's Landing, that didn't exist. It was a ship port, and we have the creation of groups like the United States Marine Corps actually took place in a tavern, right?
Yeah, Sun Tavern, right?
Sun Tavern, 1775, November 10th.
As Marine, every Marine knows that, and I think every Marine shows up in South Philadelphia in November.
Yeah. But there's an example of a pretty, what would be considered bawdy group, right? But they're bound together by this ideal of we're not going to get pushed around, we're going to band together, and in a very similar spirit, even though there was infighting amongst the various populations throughout Philadelphia, and actually on the East Coast, all the 13, what were the original 13 colonies, they were able to reach a consensus, right? Come up with a plan, and even in the most trying of times, maintain the discipline to work through those issues and have a very, at times, uncivil discourse, but a discourse nonetheless.
Yeah, that conversation is important. And, and as you're talking about the various constituencies, one group that we shouldn't overlook are the veterans of that war, because there was, after that war and then wars through the 19th century, efforts by officers to create, after the war against Mexico, for example, they created the Aztec Society or the Society of the Cincinnati, things like that. But, regular soldiers, I mean, there was no GI Bill. There were no veterans benefits. And there was, I dove into the history of this a few years ago. There's a great project online that your viewers might want to take a look at. It's called the Encyclopedia Greater Philadelphia. Charlene Myers, who's a professor at Rutgers, it's essentially an encyclopedia of Philadelphia history online that covers everything from the Spanish flu to. And I've written a few things for them. I'll send you the link. It's a
yes,
history.
Please do. I think that would be a good thing for our guests to reference.
Yeah, and so I wrote a history of veterans organizations in our area, and over time, it's veterans coming together and creating lobbying groups and doing things sort of through the process, right, and through conversations that ultimately create, the kinds of resources that we have today and the kinds of awareness that we have for veterans, coming back in our own time, to provide everything from, the VA to GI Bill rights to all the rest. One of the things that I do on our campus is I advise our student veterans. And, and it's heartening that, they know they have those resources. And they also know, too, that they have the gratitude of, the campus community and the greater community for, doing and offering the kind of service that they have in recent years.
Yeah, and that's a very important point. Yeah, that community is very, very strong. In particular, at Westchester University, they have the one Veterans Affairs building on
Yes.
On Route 100.
Yes, that's correct.
On High Street. And it's very well attended. It's very active, and it helps people make that transition from the war footing, war stance, battle space mindset into now becoming a student and hopefully taking those experiences and advancing us forward to deal with the next set of challenges that come along. So, we talk about the greatest generation, and as we are speaking, the next great generation is being created in that same kind of spirit, that same kind of vein. The other thing I noticed in this area is, talking about Benjamin Franklin, his talent as a diplomat helped to create alliances overseas that helped us. So, in other words, we owe a lot of great debt of gratitude to the French, to the some of the other countries, like for instance, Poland gave us General Kosciuszko, who was very instrumental in helping us fight the Prussians. Of course, they were fighting against the Hessians, but so yeah, there's a lot of the enemy of my enemies is my friend kind of thing. So there's.
I think there's a great so what to that too, Victor, right?
Yes.
I mean, in our own time, I mean, if you consider where we started as 13 colonies, we needed to fight against the British the way we did because, I mean, they were the equivalent of us at the time. They were the superpower. We needed allies at the time because we were 13 colonies.
Yeah.
As we've grown more powerful into our own time, it's I think a useful reminder, to maintain that flexibility and also look globally for cooperation, whether it's in wartime or peacetime.
Yeah.
Because since July 4th, 1776, the world is a much smaller place, right? I mean, you're flying around all over the place, and of course, there were no planes in 1776, and so, there's a greater sense of a global community, and it's important, I think, not just for the United States, but for all nations to sort of think on those terms.
Yeah, and so there's another great book. It was written by Nathaniel Philbrick, if I remember correctly. It was, what was the name of the book? The story of the Whaleship Essex.
Oh, okay.
Right. And why is that significant? Because, whaling, prior to our involvement in the Revolutionary War, was the way we got around, and we're supplying oil to light the cities and the towns that we know today, like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, so on and so forth. Bacon, wax, all that kind of stuff. It paved the way for us to develop a navy that was capable of now going all the way out to Tunisia. When we think about the Barbary Wars and all that other stuff which took place later.
Pirates.
Yes. Barbary pirates. Well, that gave us the capability for doing that. So we're different in many other nations in that besides the diplomacy, besides the military action, besides this idea of what's called America, that we had to also incorporate commercialism, that we ran businesses, which was different. The British were interested in planting a flag, and we were being driven not only by planting flags, but also creating business opportunities.
Yeah, sure. The original, I mean, as the war began and they talked about diplomacy, you know, what they devised essentially, because again, they were trying to kind of avoid entanglements of the old world, right? I mean, in some ways they saw permanent alliances as problematic because sometimes, you know, as in the case later during the First World War, where one nation gets involved with another nation and there are these treaties that bound sort of defense, it can snowball pretty quickly, right?
Yes.
And some of those alliances, you know, and the old world was looked at as sort of corrupt. And so, you know, what they drew up was something called the Model Treaty. And they offered it to the French. And essentially what it was a trade agreement. I mean, that was kind of the early ideas of diplomacy. Now, at that time, the French rejected it. And, you know, we ended up signing a much more traditional treaty with France when we did. And you know, during the Revolutionary War. But the initial thinking was exactly as you're suggesting, you know, to sort of engage with one another through free commerce, free trade, and you know, to leave the political entanglements out of it.
Yeah. So let's recap. Let's bring us back. So if you can please tell the audience the name of the professor from Rutgers who has the Philadelphia Encyclopedia.
Yes, yes. Her name is Dr. Charlene Myers. And if you just Google the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia, it'll come right up. And topics dealing with just about everything that you can imagine, you know, in the Philadelphia area's history. It's a wonderful resource. It really is. And I can tell you for writing for them, they're very, very diligent in terms of fact checking and editing and all the rest. And there's also opportunities in the pages for commentary from people who view it. I'm almost positive that the thing is going to be published as a book from the University of Pennsylvania. I think I heard that too.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah.
So what would you suggest for if we stratify good exercise for children, young adults, adults, and then history buffs? So you approach it from 4 different perspectives. What would be a good activity for a parent with young children, let's say, you know, 6 to 10 years old? What would be a good resource for them to kind of latch onto to get the essence of what the importance of Independence Day is?
Well, you know, I think, and especially in the time of social distancing, right? One activity that I think would appeal to all ages, I know it greatly appeals to myself and to students, right down the road in Melbourne is as far as I understand, it's the oldest existent battlefield in the country, the best well preserved. I'm talking about the site of the Paoli Massacre.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's, you know, the topography is still there. There's a monument that was, there's a monument that was built to the battle site. An original one, I think, that dates back to the early 1800s. It might be 1808 or 1810 that they have preserved. And doing a little bit of reading on that battle, because, you know, it's this, I mean, you know, it's a fight in the middle of an encampment that in some ways is bad for the Americans because, you know, they're routed. And General Anthony Wayne, of course, the namesake for Wayne, Pennsylvania, is the guy who gets some blame for it. But, you know, he recovers and he rehabilitates himself. And what happens after Paoli is they go to Valley Forge. And and before that, there's a battle in Germantown, which impresses the French in particular, because after Washington loses the Battle of Brandywine in September, by October, he loses the Battle of Germantown, and the Americans also lose, you know, at Paoli. But the French say, "Wow, Washington keeps losing these battles, but he keeps hitting back. You know, maybe there's something to this." And some scholars suggest that, you know, those 2 incidents, the one at Paoli and then the one at Germantown, provide the real stimulus for the French finally agreeing for a formal treaty. So as an activity, it's a really cool thing. And, you know, it's a big field and you can walk around it and there are monuments and you can do a little reading about it and everybody can social distance and it's kind of cool.
Fantastic. Fantastic. One easy solution.
There you
go. So I thank you for joining us. It's been great chatting with you. For those of you celebrating the July 4th, hope that you have a healthy July 4th and that you're able to be with friends and family in a responsible manner. And come back and see us here on Mainline Weekend and Mainline Tonight. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Dr. Kodosky, thank you for joining us. Again, always a wealth of knowledge. Always great speaking with you. And I'm pretty sure we'll have a few more conversations after this.
My pleasure, Victor. Always great to see you.
All right. Great talking with you. Have a great weekend.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.